Hey, hey, pretty, it's a flower. Here we are at the Angiosperms, the superstars of the plant kingdom. And wow, their sporophytes are much more massive and elegant and gargantuan compared to their teeny tiny gametophytes. But the gametophytes are still important. Let's see why. Some facts about flowers. Well, the flowers contain the gametophytes. The flowers have a lot of parts: sepals, petals, stamens. They're the male parts of flowers. Carpels, sometimes called pistils, sometimes called gynecium, the female part of the flower. And some details that I'm going to try to sketch. Fools go where wise men fear to tread. I really would like a blackboard. Anyway, in class, when this is done in class, we have a nice mustard flower, and we're holding it in our hands, and we are holding it by a little stalk, and we notice these appendages attached to it. Some little green ones, some really big colorful yellow ones, and some lollipop-like structures, and then in the middle something that kind of looks like a bottle. And then we learn what these things are. The stalk of an individual flower is called a pedicel. The little green leaf-like appendages are called sepals. And what sepals do is they protect the flower when it's a bud. I'm going to write protect bud. Bud needs protection. That keeps happening. I told you it keeps happening. Stay down, boy. The petals basically are advertising. What they do is they attract pollinators. And well, the basic setup of flowers is that it's a trade-off. The flower has resources that that certain insects and birds and stuff want, namely pollen or sometimes nectar. In exchange, they have the service of transporting gametes from one place to the next. It's kind of an exchange. And the petals are kind of like advertising. You drive down the road and you see like signs that advertise Wendy's or McDonald's, and they're very colorful, and they are telling you from a distance that you could come and get something in exchange for something mutually beneficial. That's what petals do. Petals are like the advertising signs at restaurants that attract customers. And in class, we would be peeling off these sepals and petals, going, she loves me not. And we would notice these lollipop-like structures, which are the male parts. And the pillow at the top is called an anther, which is basically a sac of pollen. And this little slender supporting structure is a filament. And together, those two parts, not the world's most elegant representation, but is called a stamen. And that's the male part of the flower, or collectively all of them. Now, the female part of the flower, it's a little more complicated. In fact, I didn't completely draw it. I want to draw some things that are actually inside, so I'm drawing them really faint. And the bottom part of the female part of the flower is called an ovary. And inside the ovary are what are called ovules or ovules. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. The ovary is the future fruit, and the ovules are the future seeds. That's the bottom part of and the most important part, I guess, of the female part of the flower. Let's go to the top. Let's go way to the top. The top is a part that's called the stigma. And as we will see, this is a special receptive area for pollen to be. And just connecting the two is what's called the style. So that's a little more complicated than the other parts. And together, they are called various names. I'm going to call it the pistil, Pistil. And that's the drawing of a flower. Here's not much more elegant, but better because blackboards are easier to write on than this Windows Surface Pro 2. And as we see, there's the stalk of an individual flower, which is called a pedicel. Sepals protect the flower and bud. They're usually green, not always. Petals, often colorful. Male part is called a stamen, with the stalk that supports a pollen sac. And the pistil has 3 parts. And the bottom part is going to become a fruit someday, and inside there will be seeds. Here's an unlabeled diagram that, when labeled, looks like this. Pretty much the same information. Interesting configuration of the ovary here. It has a partition in it, and there's basically seeds on one side and seeds on the other. So what I would like for us to think about is how flowers reproduce. And so flower sex. And given this is sort of intricate and a little hard to draw, it's easier in a blackboard, but this thing's annoying. So let's just see what it looks like on a blackboard. So this is what I would draw if drawing were not a pain. And here we have a male part of a flower. It's an anther with pollen supported by a filament. It's called a stamen. And we have, find something to draw with. Does that work? Neat. Oh, cool. And here we have the female part of the flower, and it's the pistil with the ovary at the bottom with the ovules inside. And the important things to know are that pollen grains contain sperm, and the ovules contain an egg. And pollination is the transfer of pollen from an anther to a stigma. The stigma is a very special part of a flower. It's a receptive surface that a pollen grain is a living thing. In fact, stretching the definition a tiny little bit, a pollen grain is actually a plant. And this is getting to the answer to the question of what are the gametophytes in flowering plants? And that's where we're going to end this unit on the plant kingdom. So a pollen grain finding itself on this very special environment, which is the stigma that has just the right genetic and chemical conditions for the pollen to grow. And the pollen grows a tube. It's not, I want to make it clear that the pollen tube is not a tube through which the pollen grows. The pollen tube is a tubular extension of the pollen grain. So it starts off sort of spherical and it bulges out and it grows all the way down the style and it enters the ovule. And sperm from inside the pollen grain enters the ovule where there is an egg and fertilization takes place. Ta-da! And that ovary, which contains ovules, when fertilization takes place and the embryos develop, they become seeds, which are baby plants. So that's flower sex. There's 2 parts to it. The first part is just the transfer of pollen. It's pollination. And the second part is the fertilization, where the sperm and the egg fuse together to make a zygote. So pollination is necessary in order for fertilization to take place. So, what is a fruit? A fruit is white. Well, you can't write white on white. Might be fun. A fruit is a. We're going to go into some detail about fruit, but a fruit is a ripened ovary containing seeds. We're going to go in some detail about different types of fruits. A little exclamation point to make it seem exciting. So here is the extension of this diagram on the blackboard. And so when the fertilization takes place, the ovary swells up and the stigma and the style fall off. And what we have is something that's larger usually. And The ovary is now the wall of the fruit, and inside the ovules they are now seeds. And the seed is basically an embryo plant. It's a baby plant that has a covering around it and some nutritive tissue that to support that. And we're going to look at that in some more detail. So what we're ending up with is like, what are the gametophytes in flowering plants? And I'd like to describe them to you. They're very, very small. Remember this evolutionary tendency for the gametophyte to get small compared to the sporophyte. So in mosses, remember the gametophyte's the dominant generation, and the sporophytes are smaller usually and sort of attached to the gametophytes. And in ferns, the gametophyte is like about the size of a fingernail, but the fern is like a big old fern. In flowering plants, well, I'll show you what they are. Let's start with the female gametophyte. So the female gametophyte, I'm going to abbreviate it, female G-phyte. So maybe I can fit them both on the same page. I'm going to endeavor to do that. And here's the male gametophyte. The female gametophyte is inside the ovule. So inside what becomes a seed is a microscopic structure that's kind of shaped like a racetrack. It's elliptical. And it's connected, by the way, to the rest of the plant with a tissue that's kind of like an umbilical cord, kind of like a placenta. And there's this little opening here called a micropyle. It's a funny word. A micropyle. It's kind of like an opening. And I'm going to tell you what's inside the ovule sac, the female gametophyte. And and it turns out there's only 8 cells. 1, 2 in the middle, 3 at the top, and 3 at the bottom. Math even I can do. That makes 8. And we really only care about 3 of them. But I'm going to tell you what they all are. The ones at the top. Whoop. Hey, where'd you go? We got to solve that problem before too long. Yeah, flowers. The ones at the top. The ones at the top are called antipodals. Antipodals. Doesn't matter how I pronounce them because we don't really care about them. And 2 of the ones at the side are called synergids. And you know what? We don't really care too much about them either, but I'm just going to write their name because I want to just get them out of the way. The 2 in the middle we are going to super care about. They're called central cells. It's a little confusing what are cells and what are nuclei. Sometimes these are called polar bodies. We'll call them central cells. And, class, I have a question. What is this one cell that's left? The question is, what is this? And the answer is an egg. Kind of has to be, because remember, this is a female gametophyte, and female gametophytes have gametes, and the egg is the female gamete, and there was nothing left, so that was it. Boom. This is the egg. And that little 8-celled thing, or 8 nucleus thing that's tiny, 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 that is the female gametophyte, and it's contained completely within the sporophyte. That's how small the gametophyte is in flowering plants. But wait, we're getting even smaller. The male gametophyte is a germinated pollen grain. So remember when the pollen landed on the stigma and grew that tube. So this is what it might have looked like. So here's the pollen grain, and here's this tube. Kind of looks like a nose. So this is nice. And I'll maybe draw like a covering on the outside of the pollen grain. It might be irritating and cause allergies. And the pollen grain contains 3 cells, or nuclei. It's a little confusing which are cells and which are nuclei, but what would it call them? And one of them ends up looking like a face. One of them is called the tube nucleus, and this is basically the control center for the activities, the physiological activities of this, because this is a living thing. This is a plant. This germinated pollen grain, this thing that's really microscopic and only has 3 cells, is a plant. It's the male gametophyte. That's how small the gametophytes are. And the next question is, what are the other cells? And the answer is, should be deducible, because they are sperm. Because it's a male gametophyte and has to produce gametes, and the gametes are sperm. And I drew two, and that was deliberate, because angiosperms, pollen contains two sperm. And that is because of this unusual thing that happens in flowering plants that's called double fertilization. So I'm going to, rather than try to draw again, because that doesn't go too well, let's go back and look at the female gametophyte. So, and we have some cells we cared about, some cells we didn't. Remember, the one we cared about was the egg, and the other ones we cared about are these central cells. And oh, by the way, these are gametophytes, so these nuclei are haploid. The egg is haploid, and so are the central cells. The sperm is haploid. And central cells, there's two of them. And egg, there's one of them. And sperm, there's two of them. So we're kind of setting up the stage here for like some kind of drama. It turns out in flowering plants there's this thing called double fertilization. And it turns out that there are two sperm in each pollen grain. And I don't know how they decide which one does what. Do they flip a coin or something? One sperm does what you would expect sperm to do, and it fuses with the egg to make a fertilized egg, zygote, embryo, ta-da, and that becomes the baby plant. And that's kind of what you would expect. What about the other one? The other sperm, what the other sperm does is it fuses with both. I'm going to underline that because it's a surprise. Central cells, and so let's take a look at this. One other sperm. The sperm is haploid, and we have two central cells. We have two haploid nuclei. So I'm going to write N plus N. Math even I can do. Do 3. It forms a tissue which is triploid, not diploid, because that's two sets of chromosomes. This is 3. It forms a triploid tissue that is called endosperm. Again, sorry about that, because sperm about 30 seconds ago meant gamete, but in this sense it means a seed. Endosperm. This is a tissue that's inside the seed, endosperm. And what this is a nutritive tissue. Remember that this baby embryo needs to develop and has to have some food when it starts life. And basically what this seems to be, this phenomenon of double fertilization, which is the flowering plant thing, where the pollen grains have two sperm. One of them fuses with the egg to make ultimately an embryo. The other one starts the process of making food for that embryo. And I think it's an adaptation so that under circumstances where fertilization doesn't take place, if a plant made all this very expensive endosperm in order to nourish a baby that isn't there, it would be kind of wasteful. So these concomitant, simultaneous. The process by which the embryo happens is simultaneous and linked to the process by which the nutritive tissue happens. So double fertilization is a way of making sure there's not some wasteful production of endosperm when there's no need for it. Ta-da! And that's a flowering plant thing. And let's take a look, please, at some flowers. Here's a picture of a flower showing sepals and petals and stamens, and sort of in the center is the pistil right there. Let's look at some more flowers. Here's a flower called, oh, by the way, this flower was called toothwort. It's a member of the mustard family. Easy to recognize by its 4 sepals and 4 petals, 6 stamens, 4 of them are long and 2 of them are short. It's one of our plant families we're going to learn. This is a family that's got a little bit of difference in the way the flowers are configured. The ovary is kind of at the bottom here, and these very beautiful stamens, and this four-branched style, very elegant and beautiful. This is called Evening Primrose. This is Redbud, a tree that just finished flowering. And so this is redbud and flower, and these are the fruits, the young fruits, the ripened ovary of redbud. This is another member of that same plant family. On the left you can see some flowers, and lower you can see some fruits. This is a picture of a hibiscus plant, one of my fave plants. It's got a lot of bushy stamens that are kind of crowded around the style with 5 branches of the stigma. And when this plant is in fruit, the fruit looks like this. It's a 5-parted ovary with lots of ovules inside. Here's a raspberry, or a blackberry, I mean, with flowers that actually mature into several fruits, kind of clustered together. This is a buttercup, and these are the buttercup fruits. They're not very juicy. Fruits are ripened ovaries containing seeds. They aren't necessarily plump and luscious the way we think of fruits.